Pastor Jeff here. A few years ago, I believe it was Philip Yancey who wrote a book called Disappointment with God. And the fact of the matter is that many of us may find ourselves in just that place from time to time, or maybe even now, that we are disappointed with God. And I'm going to suggest that normally has to do with expectations, what we thought God would be like, how we thought God would answer prayer, maybe how we thought God should answer prayer, or what God should do. And we've tended to box God in that way, kind of put walls around. This is the way God always works, and God never works in any other way. And the idea, if you ask any group of people what the one word that would describe God, most of them would say love. And God is love. 1 John 4:8 makes that very clear to us. But it will also suggest that God being love, maybe that love does not always look the way we think it ought to look. I was reading this week in Isaiah 45, and I came across 3 verses in Isaiah 45 that maybe present that picture of God a little different than maybe what we would have expected. And the first one is found in verse 1 of Isaiah 45, and it simply reads, "Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed." Now, this is very interesting because Cyrus was a pagan king. He was the Persian king. And God says to Cyrus, "You are my anointed." It's actually the same word that is used for Messiah, meaning anointed one. And the fact that God would say of this pagan king, this Persian king, "You are my anointed," God is going to take this Persian king and he is going to use this Persian king to accomplish his will. It's similar to what we see in the book of Habakkuk, as God says of the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, that I'm going to use them to do my will, to enact that thing that I want to be done. So that in itself is rather amazing. But then as we read on in Isaiah 45, we come to verse 7. Verse 7 of Isaiah 45 says this, "The one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things." Now, like I said, that may strike us as a little unusual. That, in fact, I believe it's in the King James Version of this verse that instead of saying causing well-being and creating calamity, it actually says creating evil. Now, that certainly knocks us back on our heels a little bit, doesn't it? I, the Lord, I am the one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. Once again, God may not always act in the way that we think God ought to act, or even in the way God will act. When we read a little further down, we come to verse 9. And verse 9 of Isaiah 45 says this, "Woe to the one who quarrels with his maker, an earthenware vessel among the vessels of the earth. Will the clay say to the potter, 'What are you doing?' Or the thing you are making say, 'He has no hands'?" And the idea is it's absolutely ludicrous that as the potter would sit down to make a clay vessel, that the clay vessel would complain to the potter of what the potter is making, and yet the idea that we will quarrel with our maker. So the idea, once again, that God may not always act in the way that we think God will act. God made perfectly clear, and it's a verse we know very well, that his ways are above our ways. His thoughts are above our thoughts. But yet, in light of who he is, in light of how he operates, in light of what he does, the decisions he makes, they are always right, they are always good, and the more we know him, the deeper worship will come out of us. I trust as we grow in our knowledge of who God is, that becomes our response. So till next time, this is Pastor Jeff.